the joys of being part of the program committee is that you get to announce and introduce people that you're passionate about. And if I can get him headed in the right direction, I don't want him to be walking out the door. We have Dr. Ed May here today, and he is an extraordinary man for a couple of reasons. One is he's a hard scientist. He trained as a physicist, and he's quite an extraordinarily brilliant one, and he's published as a standard Western physicist, the hardcore kind. In addition to that, he also is a pioneer in psi research, and he's done years and years and years of psi research. Unfortunately, most of it was classified and is just barely starting to be unclassified, so we don't get an idea of the true scope of his genius yet, which is unfortunate because having dialogued with him and watched the work that has been brought to the community, it's very clear that he is a genius. We are very, very honored to have him here. Among the various things that he has done is won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Parapsychological Association in 1996, and an Outstanding Career Award from the same association in 2007. This is a man who is clear, claims to be a skeptic, I still debate that, and is a wisdom keeper. So I hope that you will grok, in the best sense of the Heinlein word, all of the information that he brings to us today. Dr. Edwin May.
Give me a moment to start my magic timer here. It's set for 20 minutes from now. I will vanish from the stage. Let's see here, turn that on. Bear with me a moment. Okay. What I'm going to show you today is a single experiment that actually was conducted about 4 years ago. And other than just showing you some experiment, it's not my intent to get you to, quote, believe in extrasensory perception. I don't even like that word. I'm not sure what it means to believe in ESP or believe in anything for that matter. We're talking about evidence-based spirituality. Everybody here is interested in the evidence. So I hope I can tell you at least some of the evidence that contributes to my feeling that this stuff is actually real. Parapsychologists, which I don't like to use that name, I'm a physicist, and a pair of psychologists sounds pretty schizophrenic to me. Even if I were a psychologist, there would only be one of me, not a pair of us. We're notorious, and I can't blame our industry alone as being the only ones who don't replicate each other's work. But among parapsychologists, we're dreadful at reading the literature and discovering what has gone on before and learn from it and apply it to new experiments, and why wouldn't you do that? It's bizarre, but it's a matter of record. What I've done in this experiment is to take some materials that were observed outside the realm of parapsychology, decision-making in particular from Cornell University, and other forms of ideas that came from the outside, like fuzzy set mathematics. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is, and with no equations, so we're locking the doors. No one can run out of the room screaming because there are no equations in this presentation. But that is just a brief moment about fuzzy sets. Fuzzy sets are a mathematical way to incorporate ambiguity. My goodness, what a wonderful thing that is. It was developed at Berkeley in the 70s by a guy named Zadev. And what better ambiguous thing do we have than extrasensory perception? What I think the people in this room could use some aspects of fuzzy set thinking to incorporate some of the ambiguous things that we all deal with from a day-to-day basis. But I am a bit ahead of myself. Let me see if I can get this to work. ready. 1 second, and we're off and running. Okay. All right. Advances in anomalous cognition research, applying what we have learned. This is an outline. A new anomalous cognition task, AKA remote viewing. I've changed the name of the phenomenon, not to hide it from anybody, but we've talked about remote viewing. Some of you may know what that is, and you may be more familiar with the term extrasensory perception. All those terms have implicit in them some kind of a potential mechanism. I don't know what the mechanism of this stuff is just yet, but I do know what the observable is. And the observable is we become aware of some information in ways we currently don't understand, and thus the term anomalous cognition. I'm going to talk about an old way of analyzing things, but with a new twist, some study details, the results, multiple coders, people who criticized me and said, Ed, you're the judge, you're the person that's analyzed all this stuff, you faked it, or you used your own psychic ability, or who knows what all. And I said, oh yeah, why don't you code it independently? Guess what, they got pretty much the same results. A few examples, and I've already talked to you about what the definition of anomalous cognition means. Okay, here's how it would work in a laboratory setting. Someone would call a participant is locked away in a room at 10 in the morning with somebody called a monitor. At 10:05, a computer randomly picks one photograph out of a set of 300 that we have. Here's one that you might recognize. Now, this set of 300 photographs is called a target pool, and here's an example of building on things that we know. There is 40 people years worth of effort in this collection of photographs. That is a huge amount of effort. We know reasonably well what constitutes a photograph for an ESP experiment. Fortunately, some people in our community are beginning to use this target set, but that's one example of using something we know. Okay, so at this point in time, neither of these two people have any idea what picture was chosen. So this person is completely free to engage her into a very structured dialogue as to what's in her mind with regard to that randomly chosen photograph that neither of those individuals know by normal means. And that structured interview might go on for as long as 15 minutes. Often it's only 5 minutes. And in some fraction of the time, a miracle happens. She gets a sometimes fairly precise mental image picture of what that photograph is like. It's pretty rare, but it does happen from time to time. Okay, we all then have to secure all the data and give her feedback as to how well she did and so on. That does not constitute an analysis. How do we know something actually interesting happened? Well, here is an example of an Apple engineer who had never heard of extrasensory perception, didn't believe in it. Of course, he hadn't heard of it, and thought the whole thing was silly, but somehow I managed to talk this chap into coming to the lab and giving it a go. And this was his first session, and what he said was, intersection, notch, or groove, and drew that X, wave and seawall, looking down, you can see, and there he said gap. Now, I would challenge you all, if anybody here in this audience who didn't hear my lecture yesterday and knows the answer, could you raise your hand and let me know what you think the photograph is based on this information? Good, no one raised their hands. That's the right answer. There's not enough information in this to be able to tell what photograph was used. ESP is a lousy way to communicate. It's even worse than the California telephone system, which telling you is really rock bottom. So, how do we test it? Here's the picture you just saw. And the computer has chosen very wisely 5 photographs that are as different from one another as we could possibly do. And what an independent judge knows is only one thing. That is, one of these 5 pictures is the correct answer. The other 4 are not. And so a judge, in this case me, had the task of figuring out which one of these pictures best matches this stuff, which second best matches, and so on. And that's not as easy as it may look. For example, it says waves. Well, there are waves. That's a beach scene, for goodness sakes. there's a big X. Well, there's one, but hey, this could be X's too. There is a seawall. Well, it's not a seawall. Come on, Ed. It's a wall of rock with water running down it, so how far do you want to push this allegory? And then finally, looking down on the city, you might say that there's gaps there. Oops, got to hit this one. So, each of you can try to decide which is the best match for you. Here's the ones that I chose. I said the windmill was the best match to it, the beach scene the second, and so on. Turned out, in this particular case, I was right. So you would not have been able to imagine this was a windmill system just from this data alone. So that's one of the challenges. I'm not going to bore you all with statistics. We did there was 3 Apple engineers, and they produced a highly significant result. This stuff is real. Okay, here's the new stuff. Time. Here's how we do precognition. And just to remind you that precognition means peeking slightly into the future. So how does this work? Okay, at this point in time, we have the session complete. Someone has done it and produced a drawing way back then in time. We respond, I type the response into the computer. The computer then knows about the response. The computer then picks 3 targets, not based on the response. That's very important to know. Picks 3 pictures that are different from one another. Computer judged, and the computer analyzes everything. Humans, look, Ma, no hands. There was no human intervention at all in the assessment of this material in this experiment. And when we get near the end, I will tell you why that is a massive advancement. And then finally, we flip a 3-sided coin to find out what the answer is. And then you can tell whether it worked or not. 3-sided coin. It has to land on an edge, and that rarely happens. Okay. Then we give feedback to know how well it worked. All right, here's how it looks in a little more detail. An experimenter between 10 and 10:15 hits the start button on the computer screen, and here's the participant, and produces something that looks like that, just like we've seen before. Again, at this point in time, nobody knows the answer because even the computer hasn't picked a picture yet. This is all precognition. So here's a complete response. And it's a little hard to read. I would ignore this target break words. We use, in this protocol with this particular individual, his name is Nevin Lance. He's a PhD clinical psychologist, but we use like a word association test to try to trigger his response. And the word that we use to get him to respond, the first thing that pops into his mind is the word target. So I say target, he writes it down and scribbles. And then I say break, and then we talk about movies or whatever and do it again and again. Okay. Now, my job here is to take this material, and you can see it here. It says mountains and slopes and looks like buildings sitting here, and encode that in a way that the computer could understand it. And I think I've got that coding scheme here. This is what's called a fuzzy set encoding scheme. What it does is allow me to make a subjective, ambiguous assessment as to what was meant in that previous drawing. For example, there's buildings, and I gave it 100%, where I only give village and towns a very small scale. I'm not going to go through each one of these things, because I was a little bit convinced that he meant villages because he has multiple buildings here, but he says buildings. So by this way, I encode this person's response into the computer. It's not my encoding to convince, for me to say, well, is this response in the target or not? I have no idea. All I'm doing is just taking what the guy produced and putting it in terms of a way that the computer could understand it. So at this point in time, I have a mathematical representation of the target, I have a mathematical representation of this response, and then it does some arithmetic gymnastics to come up with an answer. And either it's right, wrong, or in between, and you'll see how well it worked. As soon as I hit OK from that response, a random choice is made on how to pick the target, and it produces this shot. And this is the output of the fuzzy set. And let me explain what that means in English. A fuzzy set is a way I can compute how accurate was this person's response. In other words, how much of the intended target material did this person get correctly? That's the accuracy. That's not alone enough to convince you that something interesting is happening, because I could read the Encyclopedia Britannica and manage to get 100% accuracy regardless of what the target was. I'd mention everything under the sun. So to guard against that, we have something called reliability. And then what we mean by reliability here is how much of what he said was correct. How reliable of a remote viewer is he? Did he get most of his stuff right or only a little bit of his stuff right? And it turns out the product of those two numbers is called the figure of merit. So these are the figure of merits, and there are some numbers, and who knows what those numbers mean, what I'm about to tell you. These are the three targets that the computer randomly selected and labeled them high, low, and in between. They just labeled the names of those targets that way. And the high target had the lowest figure of merit, the in between had the next lowest, and this one, the low target had a very high figure of merit. So how does that work? Here's the feedback. This is the target that the guy was describing. And what you can see here is it's pretty good. He's missing buildings, however, and there's a kind of a river here. There's mountains in the background. It's not bad. And it turns out it's what's called a significant figure of merit. I can get statistical significance in a single trial. That has no meaning unless you're a statistician, but it's remarkable, and that's a major advance in this particular domain. So how do we do that? Well, I have some examples from these same three people with the same target pool, and I can construct an idea of what the distribution of figure of merits, how big or how small or how often they get when there's no ESP functioning whatsoever. That's called the null distribution, and it's labeled here in blue. I'm not going to go into the technical details of what all this means, but it's a way I can compute whether or not the figure of merit is good enough to be above this magical red line, and I call that investment grade remote viewing, which portends what we're using this for. Okay, hypothesis. Automatic judging would produce significant hits in 50 trials. We did 50 of these. Automatic judging, no hands, Ma, no hands. Significant figures of merit are reliable confidence indicators. In other words, when the figure of merit was above that red line, I say it's investment quality remote viewing. I believe that it's really good. Whether it's really good or not, I don't know. We're going to test it right here, and you bet it's very good. A priori results up front. There were 32 hits out of 50 trials, and that's significant, and 17 hits, blah, blah, blah. But there were 12 of the 50 that met this magical limit of what I call investment quality remote viewing, and of those 12, 10 were correct. That has never been seen, as far as I know, in the history of parapsychology without redundancy coding. And that tells you that you can incorporate new material, new information, using the best possible psychics, if you will, the best analytical procedures, using fuzzy arithmetic from other disciplines, using decision algorithms from that were known. It turns out a guy named Robin Dawes, I think that's in my next slide. No, let me go back. Robin Dawes wrote a book on decision-making in an irrational world. And what he parsed out was where computers are better at decisions than humans and vice versa. Turns out that humans are far better than computers at making up the criteria on which judgments are going to be made. But having set those criteria, humans get the hell out of the way. The computers are much more reliable and much saner as a way to do that. I've been a person judge of this material for 25 years, and I'm very good at it. But I'm a person, and I now let the computer do it. It's much better than I am. And you can see the results here. That's how we integrate new ideas to get very good results. Now I just have a bunch of examples. This was probably, physicists like to talk about our typical result, but they really mean typical best ever. This is a typical best ever in this series. And you can see here, the target was a bunch of mountains, and this guy said a bunch of mountains with a flow, and it was near perfect. And for those statistically minded, that's the z-score we got on a single trial. You normally don't get that in this kind of work. This one's a little bit less. This is a woman who I now can name as of about last week. Her name's Angela Ford. She's just retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was a remote viewer for them for many years. She's retired and going into the private sector. One crackerjack remote viewer. She's as good as anybody. And this is still significant. In other words, the Z is above the magic 0.05 level, but you can see there are things here that don't work very well. She did get towers and domes and so on. But remember, the human didn't make this decision. The computer did. I would have probably screwed it up if I had been the judge. Here's one that's frankly pretty crummy. This person got white and missed the bridge and so on, and it's not very good. Here's one that's positively dreadful. It's a mountain again, and this person's he's got mountains, but water and lakes and buildings, none of which are there. So this is a spectrum of things that we get in this kind of a study. It was 50 trials. We probably did this over a space of about 2 months. So we do them very slowly, not to bore us or them, the participants. I was the single experimenter when we started this. I coded all those responses. And of course, I'm blind to all the targets, of course. And my colleagues yelled at me, and they said, "Oh, you're psychic, Ed. The reason this all works so well is because you just knew what to code and what to ignore." And I said, "Oh, yeah? Why don't you guys do it?" So Richard Broughton from the UK and Vasi Zoltan from Budapest independently in a different language coded these things, and at least in some sense got the same results. What are they? The good news, all 3 response coders, these people that looked independently, had the right number of first place hits, and statistics were all just about equivalent. The bad news is, I was the only one that got 10 out of 12 significant hits. Now that shouldn't be a big surprise. That shouldn't scare you. If you want to be a judge or find a judge for the ice skating competition of the Winter Olympics, would you randomly grab people off the street? Absolutely not. You'd go and find people who knew something about ice skating and have them be the analysts. So I've been doing this for 30 some odd years or a little less. I know and I believe I can teach how one does this analysis, how one should pay attention to what things to encode and all that. And I think we speculate that makes the difference between the successes of the significant runs compared to the ones that weren't. This is the answer for the 3 coders, and you can see mine here. I think I've got it. Oops, no. This one here. They had almost a chance results, but I've got these. And it was a very, very strong result. I'm not going to bother with the next 2 slides. They're correlations, and I can just say in English what they are. If you want to know how well each of these independent coders correlated with my work, well, to first order, they have to correlate very, very well, and that's an artifact because the rules are, if the person says buildings, you are obligated by the rules to give that person 100% for saying buildings. I mean, they said buildings. So there's an awful lot in this material. Of course they're correlating because there's no room for disagreement. There's a slight disagreement. Well, I'm not sure it's, I give them 20% for buildings and maybe a skeptic give them 10% for buildings. So there is some variation of that, but to show the pictures, I'll just rush through them, it doesn't matter. So conclusions, and I've rushed through this a little bit because I'm more interested in what you have to say than having you listen to me. Judge-free method produces significant results. And that's very important. Judge-free meaning the computer is doing this, not me. Perhaps of the reduced variance by reduced subjective assessment. When humans are asked to make a subjective assessment, we're notoriously terrible at that. And the computer is much more consistent with that. And my suspicions are it's that consistency which led to this really quite remarkable result. Maybe to produce significant confidence calls, we need a trained, experienced coder, is what I was saying about myself. Or maybe I should be psychic. That could help too. Okay, applying what we know. If you want to do these experiments, please don't start from scratch. Come on, this discipline has been around for 150 years, certainly for the last 40 or 50 of which there's been really quantitative, careful studies in the published peer-reviewed literature. Don't make it up as you go along. Start from somewhere, modify the hell out of it because we're a bunch of old guys. You're a bunch of new people. Figure out and not to make the same mistakes we did. If you want to study high jumping, and you randomly sample people from the population to study high jumping, and I'm included in that group, I'm going to drastically distort your statistics. I can high jump maybe on a good day 3 inches, not 6 feet. So what do you do if you want to study high jumping? You don't randomly sample people from the population at large. You go find people who can in fact do high jumping and study them. So it has been part of our game forever to only use what in the literature is called selected participants, people that had a proven track record that can do this. Why would you do it differently? You shouldn't, unless you're asking a different question. And it's an equally interesting and valid question, that is, how is this innate talent spread in the population at large? That's an interesting question, in which case you better do some random sampling. I'm not interested in that question until I understand how this phenomenon works better. And so if I want to study this phenomenon, let's find people that in fact can do it. Now, the bad news is we couldn't find, after spending $20 million US and 20 some odd years, we could not find predictors, not for lack of looking, I can assure you, that predicts future performance in ESP ability. We looked at every psychological, pathological, or healthy personality assessments. We looked at behavior measures. We looked at psychophysiological measures. We looked at everything that you could think of. Nothing was a predictor of good performance. So lacking that, the only way you can do is find rooms full of people like you, have them all remote view and pick the good ones and test them in the lab, and out of that, a certain few drop out. Joe McMonagle is a name known to some of you. He was an Army remote viewer for years, one of the best tested so-called psychics on the planet. He was winnowed out of 3,500 intelligence officers. 6 people came out of that. And those 6 people came to SRI in the 70s, and of those 6, 4 produced independently significant results. So that was a way of screening. And we've looked at these people. What makes these guys so special? I'm sorry to report, nothing. They have a slightly higher IQ, maybe. That's open to question. They would all kill me, but I'm going to say it anyway. There is one thing that does separate them from the population at large, and I'm serious about this to some degree. They have an exaggerated sense of confidence. And I don't mean confidence in this task. They all have other lives. And they have huge, nothing can go wrong. They're 7 on the Enneagram scale. They are off the charts optimists. You know, the definition of an optimist is a pessimist with more information, or a chap having jumped off the 50-story building, passing floor 23 says, so far so good. These guys are really fabulously optimistic, and hardly any of it's actually justified. Hey, I don't need a map, I'll direct you, Ed. Oh, for crying out loud, we're lost again, Joe. Give me a break, you know. So, but they do have that really strong sense of self-confidence, and sometimes it makes them a giant pain in the ass, to be brief about it, and sometimes very difficult to work with. But they are marvelous. The team that we have about 7 people, Joe and Angela, and I can name one other person, Nevin Lance. He's a PhD psychologist, trained. And none of these 3 people are emotionally invested in the outcomes of their studies. Failed today, big deal, see you tomorrow. And I think psychologically that turns out to be an extraordinary important aspect, because we've had difficulty within our groups of having to deal with people that began to define their sense of well-being in their ability to do this funny thing in the laboratory. And that became very troublesome and disruptive, both in the Fort Meade Army group and in our group at SRI and SAIC. Fuzzy sets, I've talked a little bit about it, a way to capture ambiguity in quantitative ways. And I've mentioned Robin Dawes on decision making. That was brilliant on his half. I mean, if you can offload to the computer to make decisions that you don't have to, you're going to be way ahead of the game. If I had to pick one thing that made this result possible, which is utterly astounding, is the fact that computers did the judging and I, fallible human, got out of the way. 10 out of 12 correct in a 1 in 3 guessing game. And to my knowledge, maybe Charlie and Larry Dossi can correct me, I know of no statistic on a single set of experiments like that good. The result of applying what it is you know. So let's turn it over to some questions, and thank you very much for not running out of the room screaming. I appreciate it. And please speak up. I'm deaf as a stone, or almost. I think they'll bring a microphone over to you there.
Many people in the world, probably many in this room, have had experiences of being able to see. And in my experience, I don't know what to do with these instances or how to expand my world of usage in a way, or experience. I sort of struggle with it.
Yes.
I don't know what to do. And I'm wondering if you might offer some help or suggestions.
Well, one thing you will learn from physicists, if they don't know the answer, they are more than willing to make it up. So here's my makeup. Yeah, I don't mean to belittle your question. It's a very serious and important question. First off, contrary to some of my colleagues in the field, I honor you people who are often experiential based. If it weren't for people having experiences that caught their attention, I wouldn't have a job. So thank you, thank you. There was a book written in the 70s by Douglas Dean called Executive ESP. And the bottom take-home message there is he found that executive salaries correlated with their psychic abilities on a blind psychic test that they didn't know about, but did not correlate with their belief in ESP. The take-home message there is you get paid the big bucks as an executive by making wiser decisions in the absence of data. And so it would be bizarre if anomalous cognition is real, and I think it is, that we wouldn't integrate that into our normal life stuff. So to answer your question directly, you're already doing it. If you're successful at anything, part of that success, and please don't misunderstand me, do not trust intuition and ESP exclusively for anything, because you will suffer mightily if you do that. But to ignore it, you will also suffer mightily. So already below the level of conscious awareness, this kinds of ability are integrated into our well-being, I believe. Others?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Very short question, but this is totally new to me, and so I'm missing something from your study design, if you could clarify. So all the results you just went through were the precognition, is that correct? So they draw what they think they see, then you code it. At what point does the computer pick the picture? After you code it? Because if it's after you code it, it seems like you're leading the witness sort of thing. So
that's a very good question, and I've actually changed the protocol to address that question. You have to trust me when I say the computer did not pick pictures based on the coding that I put in. It did not. That's really important. And now I have it pick pictures before I put the coding in, but after they've done the remote viewing, which cleans up that protocol.
So
it was a
you
flaw.
switched it. Then what's the point of coding it at all then? Why is there coding from you if the picture's already been picked and that sort of thing? What does that give you?
Because what I wanted to do is to have the computer do the judging, not me. And the reason I wanted the computer to do the judging is to take advances that the computer's a better judge than I am. But the computer doesn't know what to do with a sheet of paper with scribbles on it. So what I would try to do, I could, if I were clever, scan it into my computer, but then I got to get clever artificial intelligence programs that can read squiggles and convert it into words and do all that stuff. Instead, I'm pretty good at that. I can look at a squiggle and say, oh, that looks like a mountain, and give it credit for or not as a mountain. That's why.
Sorry, though, and I apologize. I'm just still not quite getting it. So, but if you even switch the experiment that the picture's already been chosen, so if you code afterwards, I'm still missing.
I don't know what the target is. It's been chosen in the computer, but they don't show me.
Right.
So I don't code. I say, oh, look, the picture is a building, so I'll give this guy lots more credit for a building. That's called cheating. So I'm completely blind as to the choice of the targets.
So when you code,
what do I know?
No, what are you getting? I'm lost because the guy remote viewed. I'm sorry, maybe I'm missing a major point.
Not a problem.
The guy remote viewed, and then the picture's chosen, and then why
Okay.
bother to code?
Let me say it again, I think it'll be clear. Okay. Let's suppose you do a remote viewing and you hand me one sheet of paper. At that time, no targets have been chosen in the computer at all, okay? The way it works now is that after I have the piece of paper in my hand, the computer, unknown to me, randomly picks 3 very carefully chosen targets. I don't know what they are. You don't know what they are. Okay? I take your sheet of paper and convert it from piece of paper and squiggles to something the computer understands. Okay? That goes in. Then I stand back, hands behind my back, and the computer says, okay, this is picture 1, and here's what she put in. That's not a great overlap. Here's picture 2. Oh, that's a great overlap. Here's picture 3. That's not a good overlap. And it might be right or it might be wrong, and in this study, most of the time, it was very good.
Okay.
Does that help?
That explains it, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
But the difficulty there, hi, Darrell, I'm over here. Just to follow on that, is that somewhere within the system, the computer has encoded its fuzzy logic, or its fuzzy set responses for each of the 300 pictures that are part of your library. Now the question is were those human judgments that went into that coding, and then what's happening here is the computer is taking a set of criteria of human judgments of a target set, a new judgment that you just put in, and comparing those. And if that's the case, then who did that original coding?
I thank you for that marvelously geeky question, because there's a geeky answer, and I try to avoid it, but I'll try to make it plausible. These 300 photographs, I ended up with 9 enemies as a result of that, because I had all 9 people score each one of these photographs on that same fuzzy sets, and then we merged all their answers together. So what I have is a reasonable depiction of each one of these photographs by a consensus of 9 separate individuals, and that was done many years ago, 10 years ago. So I get that fuzzy set representation of this target, and it gets matched with this response, and boom, that's how it happens.
Ed?
Yeah, Larry.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I wonder if you would be willing to say something about entropy gradients in the target pool?
Oh, dear. Okay. Just briefly, Larry. I don't know if you know that all of our sensory systems that we're familiar with, our eyes, ears, taste, what have you, all of them are much more sensitive to changes of the sensory stuff at their front ends than they are to steady states. You can see a blinking light far easier than a steady light at the same intensity. Someone walks in the room with too much cologne on it, you can smell it immediately, and then the psychologists like to tell you, you habituate to it. It's as if in electrical engineering terms, it's AC coupled for good, probably evolutionary arguments. So I argued that if J.B. Rhine was correct when he said extra sensory, with the emphasis on sensory perception, is right, then it's not a bad bet to say, well, maybe, just maybe, there's something in that ESP correlates when that thing is changing compared to when that thing is not changing, like all our other sensory systems. Not a bad place to start. We found it. And the animal, the name we give it is entropy, and I really don't want to get into that. There is something mathematically we can find, and there's all kinds of reasons why this is very attractive, having to do with understanding precognition, and so on and so on. But the take-home message is that this is acting like a sensory system, not just in one experiment, by now up to 8 experiments, 2 of them conducted outside my lab, thank goodness, and they get the same results we do. And what that suggests is we're dealing with a sensory system. It does not tell me whether it's a new sensory system, an old sensory system, or some combination of the 5 we know, and I suspect that's probably it. But it tells us a lot about the internal physiology that we got to worry about. Does that help? Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Dr. May. I have one question, which is, how much do you feel the picking random images and then asking subjects to be able to see remotely, have remote cognition of those random objects minimizes the accuracy? And the point of my question is, my feeling is that if you have a familiarity with a subject of knowledge, you're more able to access information about that at a distance. For instance, I seem to be, through experience, fairly psychic, if you will, when it comes to medical issues, but I still haven't got a winning lottery ticket?
That is an absolutely marvelous question, and I'm pleased to report there is a huge literature on exactly that topic. Let's do a thought experiment. And imagine a deck of playing cards, really nice ones, and half of them are red and half of them are black. I'm going to make a really easy experiment for you. I'll randomly pick one and stick it under the desk here and ask each of you to do something really simple, just along the lines you were suggesting. Tell me, is it red or black? How simple can you get, right? Wrong, a very horrible thing to do. Why? You close your eyes and in your mental landscape, wafts before your entire experience is every red and black playing card you have seen for the last 20 years, and you played bridge last night, and there's this gleaming, wonderful experience, ace of hearts up there, and a jack of diamonds and a two of clubs. And in engineering terms, you have what is called a signal detection problem. Because if there is a signal somehow coming from this card, it ain't very big, and it has to compete with all the stuff you've generated in your brain. So it turns out, by direct, hard, quantitative measures, that the less the participant knows about the target material, the better the results. And I think for that reasonably understood thing. Yes, sir.
You started out talking about how you were going to be reviewing experiments that were done 40 years ago, but you are referencing the fuzzy logic system that is 25 years old?
Yeah,
or
25,
something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So was that analysis that was done on experimental data that was older?
Yeah, wasn't with fuzzy sets.
Okay.
Yeah, the 40 came from the 40 man years or people years that went into producing the target pool.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, the experiments that the experiment that you just described to
Yeah.
us is
Fairly new.
relatively new.
Yeah.
So could you forecast or project, looking into the future for us, where this field of remote viewing, anomalous cognition is going? Where do you see the sort of the cutting edge of this field now?
Whoa.
Or is that classified?
As Melinda told you, the Parapsychological Association graciously gave me their Career Achievement Award. Read in, "Step aside, bozo, you're too old, let the youngins take over." So with some degree of reliability, I might add, that's a good thing. But it is traditional in the Parapsychological Association meetings, the recipient of such award the following year gives a 1-hour invited address on the marvelous accomplishments you've had in your whole career, boring everybody in the room, because they already know or they wouldn't give you the award in the first place. So I started my talk by saying, I am not going to tell you anything about my achievements. They're marvelous, fantastic, and you all know about them. Now, I'm going to slaughter you all, and I took them on. To answer your question, because there were some funny parts of this and a real serious part, and let me tell the real serious part. What we don't know in parapsychological phenomenon, and I'm sure Charlie and Larry and others in here will agree with this, we do not know when, where, or for how long psi happens, and to which person. I gave back a $150,000 grant I had to do a functional MRI study in conjunction with skin conductance in Edinburgh, Scotland. I gave the money back. Why? I didn't know whose head I should put in the scanner, mine or the participants, because there is experimenters' effects. And until we figure that out, we're wasting our damn time. We really are. So the short answer, which is very unhappy with my colleagues, if I had my druthers, I would let the field go fallow for 50 years and let some young'uns rediscover it and start over. Because I don't believe, certainly our group, and I am a great sinner of this, the people in our group are not qualified to take the steps that we need to take next. Because we haven't integrated this into the mainstream properly enough. We need good neuroscientists. We need good people that we don't have in our community to take the next step. And frankly, if you were somebody at the banquet dinner asked me, Ed, if I give you $1 million, what would you do next? And without a moment's hesitation, I said I'd give the money back. And I'm serious. And I've retired from active research in part because of that. Another in part, I have to publish something like 70 papers that were formerly classified and now are not, need the light of day. That's pretty depressing. Yeah, oh, for sure. Send the grants to Melinda. Okay, I let somebody else be in charge of the time. My little timer went dead, so yeah.
My wife and I, about 10, 12 years ago, took some remote viewing courses. Before taking them, I tried it out at home. I got the most spectacular results, my very number one. I never got as good in 60 or 70 trials after that. Number one was as good as anything you can see in the literature.
Sure.
Same thing happened to me in medical intuition. Number one, I was right on. I got it just right. Now we've talked to some healers since then who laughingly said you get 3 free ones before you run into trouble. We call this beginner's luck. Now, you must have run into this if it happened to us and other people in the program. How do you deal with beginner's luck?
Big time. It's a well-observed phenomenon in the field. And since many psychologists in my discipline like to expound forever on matters quantum mechanical and physics, of which they know absolutely nothing, I'm about to do the same thing in psychology, so please forgive me. Part of that is obviously performance anxiety, whether it's conscious or not. I've done well. Oh my God, I've got to do it again, and the general's in the room with me. Oh my God, what am I going to do? It turns out that for reasons that my psychology friends can answer probably far better than I, is that the group of people that we work with have learned to overcome that anxiety and we do not see what in the field is called a decline effect. In our data, there is no decline effect at all. I've looked for it. And what decline effect means is, oh, you bring somebody in and they do really good work, and then they do a little less good work, and then finally they're at chance. And the critics say, oh, well, it's convergence to the mean. No wonder it doesn't exist. Nonsense. Those experiments are unbearably boring and repetition. I couldn't tie my shoes after a lot of those experiments. So one of the things that characterized our group and why I don't think we saw this first-time effect very much was the fact that we collected data very slowly. And if Joe McMonaco came to our lab in California and said, well, I'm ready to go to work, and I'd look at this guy, and he's been building his house, and he looks like hell from his long trip, I'd say, go to the beach, Joe, we'll see you tomorrow. Drive my mentors nuts, because he's under military contract, God damn it, get here and work. And I said, no, that's not how this works. And in our studies, no participant would do more than 2 trials a week, and no experimenter would do more than 1 trial a week to keep the interest going. This stuff gets boring really fast. And you don't want to treat it, Joe and I wrote a paper, it's actually published in the parapsychological literature, on exactly this topic. Why is it our program was so amazingly successful compared to any others in the world, as far as I know? And one of the reasons is we never treated this phenomenon lightly. We had huge respects. When someone walked into our office, we had 12 people working full-time. The whole place came to a screeching halt. All of the attention was on that trial with this person then. And it didn't matter whether you had to get a report out or whether the client was screaming for some financial stuff. All that came to a screeching halt until we put great attention upon this particular task. Now, I can't quantify that. That's something qualitative, which I can only hope other people can test, that there's attention and intention. Both of those were very high in our group.
We thought somehow the brain gets in the way of functioning, and once you get through it once, the brain says, whoa, you can't do that.
Yeah, right. My brain is my biggest problem. Any others? Questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, where? Ooh, okay.
Okay. Goes back to the protocol that you identified.
Yeah.
If I'm understanding it correctly, the remote viewing was done, then the computer chose the pictures, and then you did the interpretation. Is that correct? You looked at the picture after the computer had chosen the 3 pictures?
Yeah, in fact,
Without knowing what they were?
in this study, the only picture that was ever viewed by anybody was the right answer. We didn't look at any of the other, what are called decoy pictures,
Okay.
because that was done by the computer.
My question in terms of the sequencing is if the computer actually chose the pictures before you looked at the drawing.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Is
yeah.
there a possibility that there was some connection between the pictures that were chosen and your interpretation?
It is entirely possible. In fact, I get screwed in both dimensions. As in this case, I had the computer choose the pictures after I put in the input, okay? And then people correctly say, well, the computer knew about it. Of course, it's going to pick pictures that matches the output. That's not what actually happened. So to guard against that, I just did what you suggested. And yes, there is a psychic flaw that said, I used my psychic ability to code this in such a way to make it match right. However, there's a nice piece that argues against that. 3 independent coders long after that got essentially the same results. One question back there.
Yes, I have a question about, there's so much good information. You've done the basic science, and there's so much good information that shows that precognition and intuition is something that most humans have if they're willing to look at it. It's across culture, it's across ages, and I'm in medicine, I work with my patients with this. My question is, the research is done, and so how do we apply this? What's the application for this information, getting past all the doubt we have? It's really there. We fight it because it doesn't fit in our belief system for a lot of people. But, if it explains a lot of things that we can't explain otherwise. And so I really am looking toward application and how we can use this information to help ourselves, to help other people, whether we're in education or healing or hard science.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. First of all, applications are really important. I had a job for 20 years doing nothing but applications. Our military people could care less about how it worked, and we begged them to give us some money to figure out how it worked, and no, it was all applications oriented. The problem was they did the applications wrong, and most people do applications with this phenomenon incorrectly, and let me explain. Precognition is a miracle. I really believe it. I mean, it is as close to a miracle as this whole hard-ass atheist can talk about miracles. It really is a miracle. Okay, well, I got a miracle in my pocket. Boy, do I have applications that will bend easily to that miracle. I'll levitate a monk to the moon. I'll win the lottery. Whatever. You can always invent amazing applications if you believe this stuff is a hell of a lot stronger than it actually is. So instead, we turn the question around and saying, here's what we can validate in the laboratory, as crummy as it is, blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is, can we find applications that yield to that level of functioning? And the answer to that is yes. And let me give you at least 2. If you come to me and say, oh my God, we've got this murder victim somewhere in Washington, D.C., and the cops are looking for the body and they can't find it, and on and so on. Come to Joe McMonagle and say, okay, Joe, can you stick a pin in the map and tell us where it is? He says, nope, can't do that. And he's right. Occasionally you can do that and it makes all the big papers and the splash. But on the average, sticking a pin in the map to answer the question, where is this body, is well beyond the capability of most people, including Joe McMonagle. What we can do is say, well, you're going to search all these areas anyway. How about if I reorient the search order? Instead of going here first, go here first, go here second, go second. What I can demonstrate and defend ad nauseum is we can reduce the expenditures in time and money and resources by 10 to 20%. And sometimes, and in fact, that has saved lives. There's an example. In business, the same thing. If we could replicate this study of Douglas Dean in terms of executive ESP, I would not select your next CEO for your corporation based on that person's ability to do psychic stuff. But everything else being equal and you got a bunch of competitors, hey, pick the one who's slightly more psychic. So one has to, if you want to ask the genie a question, you better ask the right question. I mean, the Oracle at Delphi knew that, and it's still true to today. I'll give you one last funny example. Not so funny. During the Reagan administration, we had evidence many months in advance that there was going to be an attack at the Christmas tree lighting ceremony by President Reagan. So we tasked our people wrongly. We asked the wrong question. What's happening of interest on December 17th? Wrong question. But one of our people said, gave us a graphic description of a senior military officer being kidnapped from the streets in Italy. That was exactly the day that General Dozier was kidnapped from the streets of Italy. So we got the answer, but we didn't know we had the answer because we didn't ask the right question. So you have to ask the genie the right question and make sure you understand that you're asking the right question, and that's not easy. Maybe one last question. I think we're out of time. Yeah.
Yes, you kind of briefly touched on this just with this last question, but I was curious if you have, in your selected participants, allowed the emotional component or the empathic component to come in to choosing your selected participants. So for instance, if you have someone who has been kidnapped in the past, trying to find people who are kidnapped, and there's a resonance with that person or that group of people, have you looked or allowed that to come into any of your experiments?
That's a really interesting, relatively straightforward question with a bit of a complex answer, and I'm not sure my colleagues would all agree. I'll answer it in phases. Our target pool, the things that are in our photographs, we explicitly took out all the emotional content. The reason we took out all the emotional content is there's lengthy studies to show that emotional content don't matter in traditional remote viewing. That's of the target material. On the other hand, if you were emotionally engaged in a project, like, oh my God, my sister's kid was kidnapped, I really got to find this, that's a double-edged sword. It really will focus you in on the task, but it may mislead you on the task because you're so desperate to get that right answer. So I think the short answer, hearing myself speak, would be it's probably a good thing to keep it as objective and as emotion-free as possible, I think. Okay, thank you very much. Been a lot of fun.